Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at George Eastman Museum. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our Focus 45 presentation, Spirit Photography, History and Creation, with Associate Curator Heather Shannon and Historic Process Specialist Nick Brandreth, joining us live from the dark room at Eastman Museum. The museum would like to thank NEH CARES and Art Bridges for providing invaluable support for this talk, as well as many of the other virtual programs we've put on over the last few months. They've really enabled us to put together an exciting and robust set of programs to share with you all, and we're very grateful for that. We'd also like to thank our members for their continued support during these challenging times. It's been amazing to see so many of our members adapting to the virtual realm with us as we've kind of shifted our public programs to online events. This is somewhat new terrain for us. We've been doing it for past 6 months or so, starting to get into the groove of things, but it's been a little challenging to adapt to, but it's been amazing to see as we're kind of seeing today with hundreds of people logged on really from across the globe. And we're so happy to be able to bring talks to you all just outside of the Rochester area is great. For those who aren't familiar with our Focus 45 series, it is a monthly program that we host, which features a behind the scenes look at different projects going on around the museum or kind of areas of interest or topics that are kind of related to kind of some of the things that we specialize in at the museum. I think in this instance, Heather, who is a 19th century historian, her background is a 19th century historian, has a vested interest in that time period and is very knowledgeable about spirit photography. And Nick Brandreth, who I mentioned, our historic process specialist, who has been teaching spirit photography workshops and a whole host of other historic process workshops at the museum. So if you're ever interested in those, I'm sure Nick will probably talk about those today a little bit, but you can check out our website for those offerings. We do invite all attendees to ask questions at any point throughout today's discussion. So I want to make a particular emphasis on this. If you have a question for Nick or Heather, at the bottom of your screens, you should see an icon for Q&A. If you click this, you can submit your questions through there. And then at the end of the conversation, we'll go over as many of them as we have time for. Including the Q&A, the presentation will last about an hour today. There is also the chat function at the bottom of your screens. And it is open, and many of you are using it already to drop us a line, say hello, let us know where you're tuning in from. That's awesome. We love hearing from you. We do ask, though, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A and not the chat. Things can get buried very easily in the chat, and I don't want to miss any questions, as I'm sure there will be a lot of great ones. So it's just easier for us to kind of manage them in the Q&A function. So I appreciate that. We are recording today's talk. So if you'd like to watch it again, or if you want to share it with friends and colleagues, the video will be uploaded onto the Eastman Museum's YouTube page within the next week. Now I would like to turn it over to the Associate Curator in the Department of Photography at George Eastman Museum, Heather Shannon.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome everyone, and thank you for attending. Thanks in particular to our members who have been really supportive during the pandemic. And thank you to Nick Brandreth for being here. He is going to dazzle us, and one of our main goals was to have fun. And I just want to warn everybody that we had planned to do this live, as in front of a live audience. But we had to pivot a little because of the pandemic. So we're going to be toggling back and forth between PowerPoint and some sort of special camera that Nick's setup and a video. So bear with us as I maybe stumble through this a little bit. I'll try my hardest. But I wanted to start off with this amazing image. This is the first known spirit photograph by William Mumler, who is pictured, who is the living presence, well, formerly living, but at the time was living presence in this photograph. And no one, during his lifetime, no one was able to figure out quite how he did it. And so I asked Nick and my colleagues, Nick Brandreth, of course, who's here, and Mark Osterman, our historic process people, if they could possibly figure out, get to the bottom of how Mumler made his spirit photographs. Nick said, absolutely not. What it requires is the conjuring of spirits. And he has turned his dark room into a conjuring, a seance space. So with that, I turn it over to Nick.
Now, the jury's still out whether Mumler could actually summon spirits or not, but we know for a fact that Mark Osterman, the process historian, and myself can actually summon spirits. So what we need to do is we're going to start out with an ordinary printing frame, okay? And you can see inside of my printing frame, I have an ordinary photographic negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick this here for a second, and we're going to inspect the frame, okay? No trickery here, a regular piece of glass and a regular printing frame. So nothing out of the ordinary about this at all. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to load up our negative into our frame. And then we're going to put a piece of special photographic paper in there. Now you can see I'm standing here with the white lights on and the paper's not printing out. That's because I coated this with a special silver that I got from a hermit who lived in the woods. I beat him in a thumb wrestling match and he had no choice but to give me this special silver. So we're going to use this silver on our paper here and we're going to summon a ghost into this picture. I'm going to load the back onto my printing frame and we're going to close this up nice and tight. We don't want the ghost to escape from the frame. Now, what we have to do is we have to bring in our Ghostomatic. This is the strongest spirit conjuring device in all of North America. And it takes a little bit to turn it on. We got to knock 3 times. So 1, 2, 3. There we go. Now, what we have to do to help the ghost cross from their plane into ours is put a piece of tissue paper down. This tissue paper will help the ghosts feel more comfortable as they switch into our mortal plane. While we wait for the ghost to show up, because they work at their own pace, we're going to switch it back to Heather. So Heather, go ahead.
All right. So, who was William Howard Mumler? He was originally a jeweler's engraver working in Boston, and down the street from him was a photo studio, and he was interested in the wet collodion process, which Nick will talk about momentarily. So he began experimenting with it. And one day in either 1861 or 1862, it's not quite clear when his ghost finally came to him, he noticed on one of his photographic plates the spirit of a young girl who he recognized as his cousin. He thought that this must have been an amateur's mistake or a greenhorn's mistake, that his plate hasn't been sufficiently cleaned. But he tucked it away as sort of a notable curiosity. He then met a friend met with a friend who was a spiritualist, and he showed his friend this spirit photograph. His friend asked him to sign the back of the photograph, attesting to the fact that that as far as he knew, no mistake had been made, but that in fact the spirit of his cousin had shown up on his photograph. And eventually it was published, this notification of this phenomenon was published in the spiritualist magazines in New York and in Boston, the Herald of Progress in New York and the Banner of Light in Boston. Now, what was spiritualism? Spirit photography sprang from the spiritualist movement, which was at its peak in the 1850s and through the Civil War, about 10 years after the Civil War. And the spiritualist movement actually started around here in Rochester in 1848, when the famous Fox sisters claimed that they can communicate with the dead through raps, which I'm knocking on my table. You can't see my fist, but as Nick did, with raps and sounds. The spiritualist doctrine was posited as a dynamic interaction between the living and the dead, so that the dead came back to visit the living and delivered messages and engaged with the living. The movement was extremely popular, and it was allied with sort of liberal-leaning social movements like the women's rights and abolitionism, although it had its detractors, and that's important to keep in mind with Mumler's photographs. So Mumler's photographs were sort of this discovery of spirit photography, or the discovery that Mumler could summon spirits to his photographic plates was, or his photographs actually, was quite a boon to the spiritualists, because they took this as irrefutable scientific verification of their beliefs that the living and the dead could communicate with each other. Mumler he presented himself as a medium who wouldn't necessarily call the spirits, but who would ask them to visit at will. So he wasn't summoning spirits, he was sort of waiting around for them. He marketed his process, or his spirit photography, to all and sundry. However, only the most well-to-do could really afford to sit in Mumler's studio. So eventually he opens a studio. I didn't mention that, and I apologize. It costs $10 to sit for Mumler, when it normally costs people about 25 cents. So only the most well-to-do could afford it. And here we have an image of Mrs. Lincoln, Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln, who was one of his most famous sitters, with the spirit of Abraham Lincoln. This photograph is not from our collection, but most of the other ones are. Mumler claimed, like I said, that he didn't summon them, he waited for them to visit. So it could be that you would show up to Mumler's studio, as this woman here might have, expecting a visitation from a loved one, but you wouldn't necessarily get one. So not all photo sessions had successful visitations from the dead. Mumler was very theatrical. He would sometimes pass a hand over his camera, or he would step away from the camera with great grand gestures. His wife, Hannah Stewart Mumler, and he learned photography in her studio actually. She was a medium, and she would often enter the studio with various raps, suggesting to visitors that their loved ones had been summoned. It's also fun to note that she would claim that she could see the spirits in the studio and describe to the sitters what their loved ones looked like. In Boston, Mumler was his studio is very popular among spiritualists and other believers. But in 1863, one of his sitters recognized the ghost in the photograph as someone who was indeed among the living. And of course, this was a bit of a setback for Mumler. He was sort of revealed as a fraud, although people continued to believe. So I just want to read to you what the Banner of Light announced about this moment, which of course was a setback for the spiritualists, because they had hoped that they had looked to photography as verification, scientific verification of their beliefs. And in this, this well-known lecturer, whose spirit ended up being someone who was in fact living, he writes in 1863, "While I'm fully in the belief that genuine spirit likenesses have been produced through this mediumship, evidence of deception in 2 cases at least has been furnished to me, which is perfectly conclusive. Mr. Mumler, or some person connected, has been guilty of deception in palming off as genuine spirit likenesses pictures of a person who is now living in this city." End quote. So for a little while, his reputation suffered. And so in 1868, he moved his family to New York and started over again. He eventually bought a studio, and at the studio, and this happened in Boston as well, famous photographers would come and check out his process, and they couldn't find anything fraudulent in it. They would look at his plates, they would look at all of his equipment, they checked out his camera, and they couldn't figure out how he was perpetrating what some people believed to be a fraud. Because they couldn't figure it out, of course, this buoyed Mumler's reputation as an important spirit photographer. In 1869, Mumler was eventually brought to court for fraud and larceny, and many famously P.T. Barnum testified against him, trying to prove that he was a fraud. And although he was not found guilty, he was acquitted. And while one might think that this acquittal would help his reputation and solidify his reputation as a truthful spirit photographer, in fact, he was eventually condemned by the photography section of the American Institute. His reputation suffered so grievously in New York that he was forced to go back to Boston, and eventually he tried again. And so I've been showing you, and I'm just going to scroll back through, a lot of photographs made in our collection, made in Boston around the 1870s, so a little bit later in his spirit photography career. And all of these come from a carte de visite album. In the album, not all the photographs in the album are by Mumler, but in the album we have photographs with and without spirit likenesses appearing in them. This is a fabulous little carte de visite album, and I sincerely hope that someone, and I wonder if it belongs to a spiritualist. I haven't had time to research, but I sincerely hope that someone will decide to undertake this as their very own research project and figure out if it belonged to an important spiritualist. So while the spiritualist movement was sort of the impetus for the popularity of spirit photography, all of this, the 1860s, was going on in the midst of the Civil War. So I asked myself, well, how is it that these people with these spirits with bodily forms came back? Like, why do the photographs look the way they do? And I guess I read this really great book called This Republic of Suffering, and also Peter Monceau by Drew Gilpin Faust, and The Apparitionist by Peter Monceau. These are excellent books that I highly recommend, and they fit together very nicely. So the Civil War caused massive anxiety in American society because people were dying at such high rates. There was, of course, a high mortality rate during the war. But one of the things that caused anxiety was that people were dying away from their homes. These are photographs here by Alexander Gardner in the aftermath of the Battle of Antietam in 1862. And this is right around the time when Mumler's his spirit photography practice is first taking off. And these photographs were, or photographs like them, not these particular photographs, but photographs like them, were displayed in Matthew Brady's studio. Brady was a prominent American photographer on Broadway in New York. And throngs of people came out to see these photographs. And in one long newspaper review of this, you can get a sense from the reviewer of the anxiety that people at home felt seeing images of dead bodies alone on the battlefield. And I'm going to read another quote because I love 19th century sources. They're really beautifully written, and I think they're fun. So says the reviewer, with a magnifier, we can make out the features of the dead. What happens if a woman recognizes her son, husband, son, or brother? How can a mother bear to know that the boy whose slumber she has cradled, and whose head her bosom pillowed against the rolling drum, called him forth? She is deprived of the privilege of touching the corpse, of kissing once more the lips, though white and cold, of smoothing back the hair from the brow, and cleansing it of bloods and stains. She would give all the remaining years of her life that heaven had allotted her. How can this mother bear to know that such a shallow trench, hastily dug, rude hand have thrown him in? So this all goes back to what began in the 1840s, 1850s of this new art of dying. And people preferred to die at home. It was called the good death, or the art of dying. It was an entrenched ideas. There were books published about how to die well. And one of the things was you would go gladly and peaceably, and you would be surrounded by your family, so that your family was assured that you had experienced a good death. At the same time, conceptions of what heaven was like changed. So heaven wasn't seen as this entering it and being the end of life, but more as an extension of life. So you would wait there for your family to join you. So heaven became sort of a domestic place where you continued living rather than you ceased living. So it was, and you kind of kept your bodily form in heaven. So it's in this context of death, and all of these ideas from the 1840s and 1850s were really consolidated during the Civil War, when people were fearful and anxious about what was happening to their loved ones on the front. So spirit photography actually brought great solace to, or spiritualism brought great solace to families who had lost loved ones during the war. On the right here, you see an image of carte de visite from the dead letter office. So letters that couldn't be delivered, and they are full of photographs of possibly missing loved ones. And I juxtaposed this with an image from our spirit photography book of an older looking woman with possibly with a younger man, which I imagine to be, but I of course have not proved, is her son. So these spirit photographs with the living, their bodies still kind of intact, reappearing and communing with the dead, gave people comforted people and gave them a sense that in fact their loved ones had died well, although if alone on the battlefields of the Civil War. So Nick. How's the Ghostomatic?
Well, it just so happens that the ghosts have decided to join us today. So we're going to switch cameras again real quick, and we're going to jump over to the wide view, and we're going to take a look at the ghosts that decided to show up this afternoon. So I'm going to switch over real quick, and here we go. So we're going to take the Ghostomatic and turn it off, and we're going to stick this out of the way because we no longer need the Ghostomatic. We're actually going to bring this a little bit closer. Okay, and now if I open the printing frame to reveal the specter inside.
Nick, so I see a ghost.
Let's open it up and take a full look at it. Now, I will tell you that the George Eastman Museum has had several ghost sightings in the past. So it's not uncommon to have a ghost appear here in the basement. But let's go ahead and show you how we really did this. The idea of making a ghost picture obviously started when photography first came around. Before there was no pictures, how would you have any idea of what a ghost photograph might be? But the thing is, the idea of printing an image with two negatives is just as foreign to most people today as it was to people in the 1860s. The only difference is, at least the average person nowadays has an idea of photo manipulation, Photoshop. We see deep fakes now with video and stuff like that, where you can put faces on to other people. The idea of a spirit photograph, though, it really comes down to a willingness to believe. Did William Mumler really summon ghosts? Perhaps. Or was he just printing two negatives on top of each other? Here's a few clues that you might look at to identify whether someone's faking it or not. Now, what you didn't see was that during my presentation, I had my ghost here tucked away in my pocket, neatly out of sight. And what I used was just a bit of sleight of hand. So I do find it ironic that P.T. Barnum did go to trial against William Mumler, quite arguably the greatest showman of all time. And all I did was, to show you this, I just simply slipped this down so it fell into place where I needed it to be. And then with large movements and sleight of hand, you're paying attention here and you're not really listening, or you really can't see as I do this. So the idea that you can put two negatives in there, and one of the things you want to look at is, as you would have seen in some of the ghost images that Heather showed you, several of the ghosts are very soft. You notice in the photograph that the young woman is very sharp. And by sharp, I mean she has lots of good definition to her. There's no softness or anything, but we can see over here, you can see that the ghost is very sharp. The reason the ghost is not sharp and out of focus is because we have two plates here together. Now, an albumin print is made via the contact printing process. If someone, people out there in the audience, if you've made a photograph in the darkroom, typically you've made a developed out print with a negative in your enlarger and projecting your image onto a light sensitive piece of paper that is developed with a chemical.
Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt you for a second. Heather, can we exit the full screen? So Nick is a bit larger on people's screens so they can see. And Nick, there have been a few requests to, when you get a second, if you can do your sleight of hand trick again.
Sure, I'll go through that again.
Yeah.
So what I would do is, it's very important to make sure that the ghoul lines up evenly with the woman. So if I put something light behind this, give me a second here to line that up, you can see it's very easy to see the specter there and the woman as well. And what I do is I make sure that it's positioned. I have an apron on here that has several pockets, as you can see. And what I do is I make sure that this is tucked in the correct position here. And I'm going to go ahead and just tie my apron back up. And as I'm talking, right, I want you to go ahead and inspect the negative. So now I've shown you that there's nothing out of the ordinary with my negative. But when I slip it in here, now it's in contact with the ghost. So when I pull it out, we have a total package here where you can see the ghost right on the plate. But notice the ghost is out of focus. And as I was saying, an albumin print and a salt print, this is actually a salted paper print. The only difference between the salted paper print and the albumin print is the layer of egg white, which would give this a very shiny surface. This is very matte because of the chemistry is within the paper fibers. But you can see that the ghost is actually, this glass is 2 millimeters thick. So the ghost is 2 millimeters away from the light sensitive surface. So for a contact print to work, your image has to be in intimate contact with your piece of paper. So the ghost being further away from the paper is out of focus. And you'll notice when you look in several of the images that Heather provided, a lot of them are posed in the manner that one would pose back in the early 19th century or the 19th century there. Photography is much more casual these days, posting selfies and being around your friends. Photography in that era was much more formal. So it's questionable to see a ghost posed in absolutely the same way that a sitter would have been posed in Mumler's studio. Now, to do this when you're being inspected would require sleight of hand. If I didn't have to worry about anyone in the room with me, I could sit here and just simply contact print these all day. I could make several of these. And that's one of the things that's interesting to note is that William Mumler was a photographer. William Mumler was not an ambrotypist or a tintypist. Today, we generally clump photography together in broad terms, but if you, in the 19th century, made ambrotypes, you were an ambrotypist. If you made tintypes, you were a tintypist. Mumler made photographs, which means he made a negative and then a photographic print from that. So Mumler was a photographer. But as I said earlier, the average person back in the day had little to no idea of how photography actually worked. Just like today, if I took 10 people and brought them into my darkroom and said, how does film develop? I'm sure there's plenty of you out in the audience, but I'm talking about the average person. Everyone has a digital camera nowadays and is familiar with photography, but how it actually works is different. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump over and Heather's gonna bring up a couple slides and we're just going to show you exactly how I did this with some slides so you have a better idea and it's a little easier to see. So as you can see on the left, we have our plain piece of glass that is necessary for the printing frame. Then we have our ghoul. This was made separately. And we have our vintage negative. So what Mumler would have done was photograph the sitter, and quite conveniently, ghosts didn't always show up to his sittings. So Mumler could take the photograph of the sitter and pair it with a photograph of the ghost. It would be beneficial to him if the sitter, who's the ghost, was maybe photographed beforehand. And he might say, do you have a photograph of the loved one? So we can help guide them to this side, some sort of showmanship. But you need to have two separate photographs. And again, most people nowadays have no concept of printing with two negatives, never mind people back in the 1860s when photography was still very young. So let's jump to the next slide. And you can see, first, the ghost has to go down. Then we'll go with the next one. This would be the sitter, and that has to be in contact with the paper, right? So the negative of the subject is touching the light sensitive paper and the ghost is behind that, so it's going to be blurry. If we go to that next slide, you can see when something, let's jump back to that first one for a sec. Notice how the background is light. It's very easy to see the ghost. If we go to the next slide where something dark is behind it, the ghost disappears. So remember, Mumler actually tricked people in real life. They sat in his studio and they watched him do this and they had no idea how he did it. But we think with a bit of sleight of hand, because remember, I'm out here in bright light. I made a ghost picture right in front of you in broad daylight. But if I was Mumler, I would have brought people into my dark room because it's dark. I can hide the illusion better. Like a good magician, you don't reveal every angle. So you have to control where people are watching you from. So again, let's jump to that next slide. If we were in the dark room under red safe light or amber safe light, probably a yellowish orange light is what they may have been using at that point in time. Again, with something light behind the image, it's very easy to see both of your negatives. But if I were Mumler and I were to present this to someone, I would ensure that something dark was behind my plate like this. So if we go to that next slide, in the dark room, it's almost impossible to see that the ghost is there. So you could be standing right next to me and not see that because look, I'm taking that picture very close to the printing frame. So let's jump to that next slide, please. And this is how this worked. Process historian Mark Osterman made this in his replicated 19th century studio in his house. And you'll see the type of camera that Mumler may have used back then. And you'll see our lovely ghost subject, the skeleton. And let's jump to the next frame. It's important to light the ghoul with something dark behind it. Because remember, the way your negative works is that this area where there's black behind the ghost, there's going to be no information. And the skeleton is white, so you'll have information in your negative, but everything behind the ghost is black, so it'll print clear. So there's no artifact of your studio or something to give the illusion away. So let's jump to that next frame. And then there you go. You could see how you would have loaded this in the dark room and presented this. There would have required a bit of sleight of hand to try to get that negative back out of there. Or Mumler could have simply said, here, assistant, take that away and bring it back if the ghost decided to show up. But what it really boils down to is people had to have a willingness to believe. Do you believe in Sasquatch? I watched that Robert Patterson video from the 70s. Pretty convincing to me. You could go on YouTube right now and watch all sorts of videos of ghosts or monsters or Bigfoots in the woods. It has to do with what you're willing to believe in. You will always have the skeptics who will never believe in that situation at all. But you'll have other people who will flock to it. They want to believe that. And, you know, exactly, you have to want to believe. Mulder, you know, let's see what happens. So yes, that's pretty much how we think Mumler did it. Is that the correct way? Is that exactly how we did this? Who knows? No one will know. Perhaps Mumler really did summon ghosts, but this is the best technique that we could surmise for Mumler to do this. And there's lots of other ways that one could go ahead and do ghost pictures, be it double exposure, long exposure. There's lots of ways to do trick photography. And Heather right here has provided a sample of a tintype. A tintype is different than an ambrotype, is different than a negative, because a negative can be reproduced, right? A negative is on glass and you can make several prints from that, where a tintype is a one of a kind. You don't have the luxury of being able to reproduce them. If you want two tintypes, one has to make two tintypes. So this is a good example of double exposure, where you have the sitter and let's just say the exposure time is 10 seconds at 5.6. You would give the sitter the initial exposure of 5 seconds with the ghost in the scene. Put your cap back on your lens, you would have your ghost leave, you would reopen the lens, and you would have your subject held still as possible, and you would record the final 5 seconds without the ghost, which means that everything behind the ghost will now be transparent and diaphanous and give the effect that someone has just visited the photo session. So that's how we decided to do it. And when we're ready, we have a special treat for everyone that you'll all enjoy given the time of year.
So you ready, Nick?
I think we can fire it up. Let's go ahead. We're going to show everybody how they can make their own spirit photograph using. Unfortunately, we wanted to try to let everybody do this with all their with all their cell phone cameras, but with some research and experimentation, we found out that you can't do this with an Android. If anybody out there has one and would like to try it, please make some ghost pictures, send them to me, and I'll make an updated video. But Heather, go ahead and let that rip.
Hey, Nick Brandreth, Historic Process Specialist here at the George Eastman Museum. Autumn and the fall are my favorite time of year. My favorite photographic activity to do during this time of year is to make spirit photographs. However, not everyone has access to dry plates in a darkroom like I do. So, in the spirit of George Eastman and making sure that photography is accessible to everyone, we're going to show you how you can make your own spirit photograph using an iPhone camera. You don't need a lot to make this work. You are going to need an iPhone with the live view setting. It's also going to be extremely helpful if you have a good steady tripod and something to hold your camera. If you don't have something like this, simply try leaning your phone up against something to keep it stable. Remember that everything has to be completely still except for the ghost subject in your scene. Everything should remain perfectly still during the exposure, and the ghost should leave the frame to create the spirit effect.
Go ahead and launch your camera app. Select the live view setting and place your self timer at 10 seconds. Trip the shutter and quickly run into your scene. Be sure to pose yourself in a way that it's easy to leave the frame, as this will help with the ghostly effect. Once the timer is up, quickly leave the frame. Go ahead and select your camera roll, swipe up on the photo, and you'll notice you have several options. Scroll over to long exposure. This will blend your live view image together to create our ghostly effect. You can try making ghost pictures with inanimate objects. Do the same thing where you quickly remove your image from the frame. Then go ahead, bring up your camera roll, swipe up, scroll over to long exposure, and see the ghostly magic happen. The most important thing when doing spirit photography is to be creative. Experiment with different locations, with different subjects, try wearing costumes, using props, anything that comes to mind. The most important thing to do is to be creative and have fun. Here are a few examples of some fun spirit photos that I made while making this video. Remember that using dark clothing against dark backgrounds and light clothing against light backgrounds will help aid in making your spirit images seem more convincing. Try experimenting with different photos in different places and try to trick your friends.
We hope you found this information helpful for making your own spirit photographs. If you make any spirit pictures and post them on social media, be sure to tag us. If you'd like to learn more about photography and all the things we do here at the George Eastman Museum, visit us on our website.
So I hope everybody will go out and give that a try. I saw a couple people make notes that you can do that with an Android. Unfortunately, I only have an iPhone, so that was the only phone I was able to experiment and test with. But if you have some information, shoot me an email and I'd love to hear more. And we can make a follow-up post about that. So we make sure that it is truly accessible to everyone and not just someone who has an iPhone. If you don't have an iPhone, maybe you have a friend who does, and you guys can get together and try to do some spirit photographs together. Remember, have fun and be creative with it. And, you know, it's a great thing. It's really fun to do around Halloween.
Well, thank you both for the fun and very informative presentation. If we can get into questions now, that would be great because there really are a lot. So just to remind everybody, if you do have questions, please submit them through the Q&A. That will be easiest for me to sort through things. We do have a lot of questions in already though. So if we don't get to your question, I do apologize, but we're gonna get through as many as we can. First, Heather, there were a lot of people asking if you could hold up the books again and say the titles of those, please.
The Apparitionists by Peter Monceau.
Okay.
And This Republic of Suffering, which is about death and dying during the Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust. Really excellent books.
Do you have any, or Nick, do either of you have any other book recommendations that people can learn more about spirit photography?
There is actually, one sec. There's a book, not necessarily spirit photography, but there's some older books. I can't remember exactly what it is, but if you want to make spirit photographs, not necessarily about the history or the subject, there's a really fun book called Photographic Amusements that was published way back. If you give me a second, I'll write and grab it.
I am putting the titles of the books and the authors into the chat as I was requested to do.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you,
Well,
Heather.
I try to be nice.
So there was a question that I will go ahead and answer. And this is our fault. I think us being presumptuous.
Sorry.
I think this was us being presumptuous and thinking that everybody knew who Mark Osterman was. He was referenced a few times. A question came in, who was Osterman? When and where did he live? Mark still is alive, and he lives in Rochester, and he works with Nick in the historic process area that's part of our conservation department. Yeah, so he is our historic process specialist at the museum, and he and Nick work very closely to put on workshops together.
Mark is a vampire. He's about 300 years old. So if you haven't met him before, just be careful. You know, he might turn you.
You would be surprised because if you met him, you might think that he did live in the 19th century, or early 20th century. He drives a Model T. So Heather, one question came in, and I'm not sure where we're at with this. Someone had asked, "Can I come in and see these photos?"
Right now the museum, because of the pandemic, is closed to visitors. But we do have the carte de visite album I mentioned. We have it completely digitized as an album. So if this person wants to email me, I can try to accommodate that. We also have collections online where you could look up spirit photos. But I will give this person my email address in the chat, which and I would be happy to try to facilitate at least digital or virtual looking for now.
Great. Yeah, and just to clarify, we're closed to researchers at the moment. We are open to the public, like the gallery spaces, and the museum is open right now with safety precautions, but researchers is what's closed. But hopefully at some point in the future, and hopefully not too distant future, you will be able to come in and hopefully be able to make an appointment to see.
Yes, I should add, otherwise the Department of Photography loves having researchers, and anyone is welcome in our study center when it's open.
Okay, so let's get into some questions here. Heather, we're now again in a period where people are dying without family members present. Perhaps spirit photography now in this era of COVID?
Um,
I don't know how to answer that, but
I don't either. Perhaps. I mean, Nick has shown us how to make them. They teach workshops, so I mean, perhaps we could conjure our loved ones. Actually, the question makes me very sad because I don't know what to say, and people are losing loved ones away from home.
yeah.
I think part of that too is, with our modern culture, we consume imagery a lot differently than they did back then. You have to remember, Heather mentioned, people saw those photographs of the Civil War. That would have been the first time anybody's ever seen anything like that. You didn't see dead bodies splaying across the field, but nowadays we could go on, you could pull up your phone and you can watch people, getting killed in the street or something like that. And I think we have a different concept of it nowadays. Back then they liked the idea. They would have a post-mortem photograph. If you had a child that didn't make it to, you would have it photographed. You might photograph your father if he passed away. So you always have that sort of memory of them. And I think it's kind of strange, where we are today. I think if you showed a modern person a post-mortem photograph, or you were to go ahead and have someone photographed like that, I think people nowadays would think you were kind of crazy. But again, I think it really boils down to what makes you comfortable and how you deal with that. I recently had to have, we put our dog to sleep, and it was a rainy day, but as she passed away, the clouds sort of opened up and the sun filled the backyard. And, was that a coincidence? Absolutely. But do I like the idea of, passing on to the next place and something nice and happy happening? Of course. And I think that's what a lot of people want. And that was what these spirit photographs, particularly during that time, I don't know how we would do that nowadays, but back then, I think it really gave people a great sense of comfort versus, nowadays.
So I put up examples of post-mortem photographs, and I don't want to leave them up too long, but the bracelet is not a post-mortem photograph, but the photograph on the left is.
Heather, a question did come in. Can you, what is the relation between post-mortem and spirit photography?
Well, I tried to suggest that this idea of heaven becoming a place of domesticity, and people passing on but not dying, not continuing to live, but living on in heaven. And I think these things are related. These phenomena of postmortem and spirit photography, the wholeness of the body, the afterlife, meeting your family once again in heaven. I think these ideas are related. I mean, I have not written a dissertation on this or anything, but I think these ideas are there.
So Mumler, this is a statement then question. Mumler was accused of breaking into houses to steal photographs of the deceased loved ones to reproduce as spirits. If he didn't or couldn't, it would mean the living sitter would have to bring a photograph of the deceased. But in that era, it would not have been uncommon that there were no photographs of them. How did Mumler get around that?
I actually have not read that he broke into people's houses to find images of people's loved ones. I think the ghostliness of the images also suggests it's hard to identify people. And Nick was talking about wanting to believe, and I think sometimes we recognize things because we want to believe that they're true.
Yeah.
It's the same idea of like looking at a photograph of the Loch Ness Monster. Is it someone's arm or is it the Loch Ness Monster? I love the idea that it is the Loch Ness Monster. So in my mind, that's not someone's arm or a log, it's the Loch Ness Monster. But it has to do with the viewers, your perception, your reality. So if you look at that and you believe it, you're not going to convince someone otherwise. And maybe with a ghost photograph, it's kind of fun. I don't know if you have to convince someone otherwise.
Let's see here. There's a question about pinhole photography, and that if there was any relationship of pinhole photography to capture spirits. Was that something that people did?
Not necessarily. Again, remember, a camera is just a box with a hole in it that lets light in. So you could make a spirit photo with a pinhole camera. You could make it with your Canon AE1, or you could make it with a 19th century 8x10 camera. It's just a matter of having something in the photograph to capture an image. I don't think the camera makes any difference when you're doing this. As you can see, I made them with my iPhone, and I often make them with my 4x5 camera and dry plates. So yeah. It's not so much the technology. It's the technology plays into the trick, but.
Yeah. Heather, have you come across spirit photography from non-US backgrounds? Was it popular in other regions, cultures?
Actually, the perfect medium, which people mentioned in the chat, was a great exhibition, is a terrific book about spirit, this phenomenon of spirit photography. So I suggest that people check that out for more examples beyond the United States.
Okay, Nick, I want to get into some, there were some questions about technique. Nick, could you explain why the sensitized paper with silver did not react with light while you put it in the frame?
Sure, great question. Because we're using, I used the salted paper process, and I mentioned the salted paper process and the albumin process chemically are very similar. The difference between the two being the egg white or the albumin in the albumin print. But both of those processes fall within the category of what we call printing out processes. I mentioned earlier that most people, if you experience photography in a 20th century or 21st century context, you've done what's called developed out processing, which means that you expose your photographic paper to through a negative, a latent image is formed, and then you have to put it into a chemical developer to turn the silver back into metallic silver. The printing out process relies on an excess of silver being coated onto your paper. So there's little bits of extra silver particles floating around in that paper. And what happens is when the light source is struck by ultraviolet light, notice how my Ghostomatic produced ultraviolet light. It has a little bit of ectoplasm and stuff like that as well, but it was an ultraviolet light source. So the act of being struck by the ultraviolet light source converts the silver metal right back into its metallic form. It wants to turn back into silver metal. You can see here the image that I made. I haven't processed it yet. So the free silver is still present within the image, and the unused silver here in my, my highlight areas is also still present. So I would have to wash this, tone it, and then fix it to remove all of the silver from this print to make it permanent. If I were to just leave this out overnight without any lights on, it will slowly turn back to silver metal. But the strong metallic light source is what goes, the strong UV light source is what converts the metallic silver in this specific type of print back into the metallic silver that we can see.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, so in a follow-up to that question for you, Nick, as early photographic emulsion was sensitive to blue spectrum of light, could that have been used as a method of manipulation of the final image / negative?
It depends. Remember that because the early photographic materials are only sensitive to violet, ultraviolet, and blue light, they're not sensitive to green, yellow, orange, or red, which is why we can handle our, photo material like historic 19th century dry plate or an amber type or a tin type. You can handle everything under red or orange safe light, just like your modern photographic paper. The reason you can print with your modern photo paper under red safe light is because it's only blue sensitive. But I would see, if I had to guess, the only way that it would come into aiding in the manipulation is, I mentioned earlier, if you're wearing darker clothes against a darker backdrop and just your white face is showing, that's the only thing that's really going to register on the negative, and the black will blend in. Versus if I'm wearing white on white, it'll show up. The blue sensitive materials, you could wear a red shirt and it's going to show up as black, or you could wear a dark green shirt and it will show up as black. If I had to guess, that would probably, off the top of my head, be, it would be about the subject and the props and how they're making the photographs, not necessarily exactly, you know, how it's capturing a spirit, but it would be how you're posing your ghost and your subject to make those make it work to your advantage. But I don't know if you gain or lose anything, particularly by using a monochromatic material versus a panchromatic material. I think you could make both work to your advantage either way.
Heather, there was a comment. I've noticed a few of the photos of the spirits have an anchor in them as well. What's the symbol of the anchor?
You know, I noticed that as well, and I am not sure. I don't know if it means you're anchored, you remain anchored to the land of the living or the world of the living. I am not sure, but I'm sure someone who specializes in spiritualism would probably have a ready answer to this question.
Okay. We only have time for just a couple more questions. I apologize, and there's so many really great ones. I apologize if we don't get to them. Nick, what did you use to expose your salt print?
So here, actually, I'll show you. So I use the Ghostomatic, right? And this is available for $29.95. You can get this at Lowe's or Tops. Or what you could do is just go on eBay, and not eBay, you could go on Amazon, and you can actually just buy one of these. This is actually just a UV light that a DJ would use during a party or something like that. Afterwards, we're going to turn off the lights and put this on, and we're going to have a ghost party down here, and we're all going to hang out. But it's just a 50-watt ultraviolet light source. You could use a black light bulb, but ideally, if I was going to print, I would actually go outside and use the sun. The sun is actually the best printing source for salted paper, albumin, collodion chloride, all of the printing out processes. You really benefit the most from using sunlight, because remember, sunlight has a full spectrum. This will only put out a little peak of ultraviolet light. If we were to look at that whole spectrum, you're only going to get a little piece of that. But again, we're here in Rochester, so if I wanted to make spirit photos in December, I might not have great sunlight or be able to go outside. So the ultraviolet light source is what you want to go ahead and use. You could use a printing unit for, what did they use? For screen printing or something like that, to use to burn in your screens and things like that. So anything that puts out strong ultraviolet light will convert your silver halide with your salted paper chemistry back into metallic silver.
Oh. Do you, let's see here. Have either of you come across any spirit stereographs?
What's it called? I wouldn't consider them spirit, but like the stereo stuff that I know is the most fun are the diabularies, which I always really enjoyed. So they're not really ghost pictures per se, like we've looked at today, but they're little scenes of devils and demons with holes poked in the back that light up. And Heather, maybe you would speak a little bit more about that.
So I haven't seen stereos by Mumbler, but I've seen stereo series that feature ghosts, and I'm guessing that they use the time photograph, like Nick was talking about earlier, with the tintypes walking in and out of the camera lens. But I have seen spirit stereos with in the context of a narrative, like a photo humor narrative.
And just to back Heather up there, if you were going to make a stereo spirit picture, you'd make it the exact same way that you would make a single negative. A stereo camera is just a big camera that has two lenses and a septum down the center. And the two lenses are positioned 2.5 inches apart from one another, and that replicates the distance of human vision. So all you would do is you would have a 5x8 plate inside of your camera, and you would have two lenses on the front, and you'd simply take off both caps at the same time, expose both sides of the plate, and you would print them next to one another like that. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to make a spirit photo. It'd be very easy, in fact, with a stereo camera. Again, it comes down to just being creative as the photographer, and we'll just say the illusionist, because if you're creating a spirit photo, you're creating a ruse. It's an illusion to try to trick people. And sometimes that's fun.
Yeah. So we do have to wrap up here in a second. So I do apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to. Like I said, there were really great questions, and I wish we had all
Somebody
day.
asked why I was wearing the gloves. The reason I was wearing the gloves is because I was handling glass negatives. And so it's just, so they don't slip out of my hand. And I was also, I sensitized the paper immediately before we started the lecture here. So I was touching chemistry before that. I did have my safety glasses on when I was using the chemistry. I don't need them on out here, but just to keep my hand safe, that's why I was wearing gloves.
Nick, can you tell us a little bit about what people can expect in terms of workshops that you all are offering? When would someone be able to when would you be running a spirit photography workshop? Do you do private one-on-one
Sure,
workshops?
absolutely.
Or Mark does private one-on-one workshops?
Both Mark and I together, let's just imagine for a moment that we're through the COVID pandemic together and everything's nice. We all have our vaccines and herd immunities, and you can come back to the George Eastman Museum and we can work in an intimate setting like a dark room. Both Mark and we will run about 20-something public workshops throughout the year in a variety of different processes, ranging from daguerreotype, dry plate, all the way up to digital negative making. We have fun workshops where we sometimes take people camping and we go on adventures. And we also have ones that are more creative, like a spirit photography workshop. And we'll actually make spirit photos in Mark Osterman's 19th-century studio. And we'll make them and you get to experience that and you get to take those things home. For the meantime, though, since we can't work together in person, we can work together over the internet. And it actually makes things a little bit more affordable for some people because not everybody can, pay for the workshop and get here all the way to Rochester. Say, for instance, if you're coming from somewhere all the way in Europe or something like that. But we will be offering workshops and private consultation in anything that we offer as a public or private workshop. If you have a group of people, say you have 6 friends who would like to learn how to make a wet collodion negative, we can get together and do that. Or if you'd like to work one-on-one with Mark or I to learn a little bit more about spirit photography, we can do that as well. We offer everything that, like I said, everything that's a public workshop, we can take care of and help you learn how to do. And we also do consultations. So you might not want to do anything hands-on or learn the process. You might just want to talk to us a little bit more and understand something a little bit better, like how a POP process works versus a DOP process. So all you have to do is visit our website, or you can email myself or Mark Osterman at photographicworkshops@eastman.org, or is it photoworkshops@eastman.org? I apologize, I should know that. But if you just visit the website, all of the information's there. And feel free to email me whenever you want with any questions. I love to talk about photography, and I'll make your ears hurt because I talk too much. So.
And as a reminder for everybody too, we are recording today's presentation. So if you'd like to revisit it, we will have it edited and hopefully up on our YouTube page within the next couple of days to a week. So I believe we will email the link as a follow-up, but if you don't catch that, check our YouTube page. We actually post all of our talks and presentations on our YouTube page. So there's a whole list of stuff that we've created over the past 6 months to dig into.
And one thing, if everybody, with the video that we made, I saw several people saying that they were excited to go ahead and try to make their own spirit photos. Again, if you do make some, please tag us on social media, as we'd love to see what you guys are up to. Have fun and be creative.
And our website, just so everybody knows, is www.eastman.org. And I believe that's all we're going to have time for today. We went 10 minutes over. It's not too bad. Thank you all for joining us. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Heather. And check our website again, eastman.org, for future demonstrations, presentations, and we will hope to see you at the next one. Bye, everybody.